read tonight. And it's in your son's name we pray. Amen. All right. We are at Exodus chapter 32. Exodus chapter 32. And we're going to be talking about the golden calf story. So when I mentioned they didn't do a good job following, you're about to find out why pretty quickly, because they just completely leave God behind on this one. But we did try to at least set up a sort of sympathetic stage for them on the thing. You got to remember, it feels kind of romantic, if I'm being honest. Yeah, well, you know. So we tried to set up the stage for them a little bit and at least try to have a little bit of understanding as to why they would lose heart. Again, what did it look like on the mountain? Fire and smoke. Do what? Thunder, scary. Yeah, I think word for what's up on the mountain. It's frightening because, it looks like anything on that mountain's going to be consumed.
They've never seen anything like it.
Never seen anything like this. They've never seen this kind of power displayed. And what did they watch Moses do? Yeah, so God called Moses up on the mountain. So he and Joshua go up on the mountain, at least part of the way. But they wait for God to call him up. And so for 6 days, they wait there on the mountain. And I would imagine if you're one of the children of Israel, you're sitting there going, what's taking so long? What are they doing? Why are they just standing there? And then there's the day when everybody's like, hey, look, Moses is going in. And Moses walks into the frightening, right? Like he walks, whether that's into the fog or cloud, or whether he just walks straight into the fire. Who knows exactly what that looked like. But he's gone in there, and he's been gone for 40 days. And so their sentiment that they say right here at the beginning of chapter 32, I think is a true expression of their concern. The latter half, we'll focus on the first half in a moment, but the latter half, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him. So how are they feeling? Yeah, like our leader's gone. And so the man, and where again, I think it's important to note, for the first half of this history that we have here of them going into their promised land, their complaints were to Moses about Moses. Because I think they give Moses way more credit than Moses deserves. They think their hope is in Moses, not God. Moses is the representative of God. He is the liaison to God. He is the one who is representing God to them. He's the man. And here they watched him go before Pharaoh. They watched him stop the plagues. They watched him hold his rod out over the Red Sea. They have watched him pray about the water. They have watched him be the one to petition God on their behalf whenever they've had a complaint. It's always been Moses, at least for the past several months, right? He's been the one who got everything done. So for him to be gone, what do? Not only is he gone, but he's gone, and what's still there? This really powerful God that they have no go-between with anymore, right? I mean, who's going to petition this God who is displayed on the mountain now? We don't have anybody else. Who is going to get that God to work on our behalf? You got to remember, they're still thinking like polytheistic people. They're still thinking like people who believe in many gods. And you see that in the first half of their statement. Make gods for us who will go before us, because this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. Now here's the thing. Here's what I think they're asking. And this is my interpretation. Take it or leave it. I think they are asking for some gods to replace Moses. not to replace the God they're seeing displayed on the mountain. Okay? They want gods who will go before them. If you're still thinking like a polytheistic person, somebody who believes in multiple gods, and you have watched this God display his power over all the other gods, but you still believe there's the other gods, but this God is most powerful, this God is most present, this God is doing the work on your behalf, but the person you had that was your go-between is gone. We need someone else to be the go-between. But who can be a go-between between that God and us? Well, it has to be some of the other gods. That's what I think is going on here, okay, personally, okay? The reason I say that is because it's odd the way some of the things are worded in here unless that is the right interpretation. Okay, Chris?
It kind of harkens back to chapter 19 where he introduces them to God.
Mm-hmm.
He goes up, and some of the elders even go up. I think you mentioned this before, and eat the presence of God.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a hard time with them because of that.
Mm-hmm.
If that was the elders, maybe the people that are calling for this or the rabble as much. It doesn't really clarify that for us, but either way, somebody should have put a stop to it, you would think.
You would think.
But they've been how many years in slavery? They have no concept of anything but that in slavery.
Yeah. Well, and at this point, part of what you also have to remember is that God is setting himself up as their only God. But how many times has God himself mentioned the other gods? That I am bringing judgment on the gods of Egypt, right? God says that. So there has been still, while I think God is being accommodative in saying that, because we find out later, I am the Lord, I am God, there is no other. Like you read that over when you get to Isaiah 45 and Isaiah 46 and those passages. I think God is being accommodative based on their misunderstanding. But ultimately what God, from the people's perspective, they need someone powerful enough or approved enough to stand between them and God. We might remember, they're frightened of this God. What did they tell Moses? You go talk to him. If we continue to hear him, we will die. Right? They recognize God's power. I don't believe at all for a moment that this is them replacing Yahweh with some other understanding of God or a statue. This is them trying to bring other gods in as the liaison between them and this most powerful God. And that's my interpretation. I'll show you why in just a moment. Lisa?
Maybe because of this side of everything, and not understanding the whole God thing. I don't know how they could think that they could replace a person, Moses, with a statue of gold that they created.
But again, the statue isn't the God itself. It is a representative of the gods. And therefore, they're paying tribute to this God by offering sacrifices to this representative of God, so that in the heavenly realm, these other gods will come in between them and the most powerful God. Does that help you kind of wrap your brain around that? And again, that was a very polytheistic pagan understanding of deity. But that seems very much in line with the way that they understood how the deities worked. And so they need someone powerful like Moses. Well, none of them have that power. So they need a powerful being to come between them and God. And part of the reason I say that is because here Aaron says, okay, take off your gold. He gives them their instruction. And then he took the gold from them, fashioned it with a graving tool, and made it into the image of a calf. And this is verse 4. Then they said, Israel, these are your gods who brought you up from the land of Egypt. Now, it's odd. Aaron makes the statue, but who makes that statement? They. not him. He doesn't say this is the God that brought you up from Egypt. They say that. Okay? And so Aaron saw this. He built an altar in front of it and made an announcement. There will be a festival to the Lord tomorrow. Not to the gods, but to Yahweh. And it uses the all capital Lord there, right? Talking about Yahweh. There will be a festival to Yahweh tomorrow. Early the next morning they rose, offered burnt offerings, and presented fellowship offering. The people sat down to eat and drink and got up to party. And so here, while they are building a statue of the gods, something that would represent the lesser gods, they are still throwing a festival for the God. And it seems to me that what they're doing, and again, this is just my interpretation, that they are paying tribute to the lesser gods to get them on their side so that they will have again a liaison between them and their God, because they're still giving worship to their God as a part of this whole snafu and mess that they're creating for themselves. Okay? And then again, you see that whenever Moses confronts Aaron. Look later in the chapter. Moses comes down from the mountain. In verse 15, verse 19, he approaches and sees the calf and the dancing. He becomes enraged and he throws the tablets. He says to Aaron in verse 21, "What did these people do to you that you have led them in such a grave sin?" "Don't be enraged, my lord," Aaron replied. "You yourself know that the people are intent on evil." So first of all, divert the attention. "They said to me, 'Make gods for us who will go before us, because this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him.' So I said, 'Give me your gold.' They gave it. I threw it in the fire, and out came this calf." Okay? Now again, obviously Aaron is arguing somewhat ignorant. I mean, part of my difficulty with this whole story is, what person in their right mind would make this story up and believe that it is believable? Right? Like it's a really, you've had your kids tell lies before, right? All of us. And they tell a lie and you're like, you really expect me to believe that? Like, you really think I'm that dumb? Anybody else had these moments? Right? And I'm like, here's a grown man, Aaron, making up the kind of story that a 4-year-old would tell, right? Like it's ridiculous. But again, I think part of the reason is, I think Aaron is leaning on the possibility that Moses will believe that the lesser gods are involved in this whole thing. And again, I don't know that. That's an assumption on my part. But I do find it interesting that here, the way all of this unfolds, we tend to think of idol worship or God, because we still think of it from monotheistic terms. You're either choosing this God or this God little g, or this God big G. And I don't think that's the scenario here. They're choosing these gods, little g, to work with their understanding of this God, big G, and that these lesser gods are going to essentially replace Moses, because they need someone to be in that role. Keith?
I'm with you. The only thing, I like the idea of but I'm with you up until verse 27. Verse 26. If they are all still for, Yahweh, just having these gods be the intermediary, why wouldn't everybody in the camp go to Moses? Who says that?
Yeah, so we'll come back to that. Okay, so hold on to that. We're going to come back to that. Chris?
Just so we don't miss the forest for the trees,
Mhm.
just keep this in perspective, at least the way I'm trying to put it all together in my mind. You got 1 million people here.
Yeah.
You got 70 elders representing 1 million people.
Mhm.
They've gone up to be with God. said, they agreed to that. And now they're going back on that agreement because one man called him. Aaron had been up there, he had been in touch with God, he had been God represented in the past. So while we're pointing fingers and trying to figure out who to blame, what we need, at least what I see in this, is a picture of the human condition. It is what it is, and that's who men are. They're going to be fickle, they're going to be liars, they're going to tell lies to cover themselves. When they have made commitments to God and now they've gone back on it, that's us.
Yeah.
As well as them. And while we're pointing fingers and trying to figure out who to blame, I think we need to understand that and get the concept that this is recorded for our learning.
Yeah. Well, and I by no means am excusing their sin. Okay. So, back Exodus chapter 20, they heard God say, "You shall make no graven images." They heard God say it. So the fact that they made a graven image in and of itself is a complete violation of the law they heard spoken from God's mouth, and they did it knowing that. So, it has not been very long since they heard those words come from God. So again, I'm not in any way excusing what they did. I'm trying to make sense of how do you so quickly dismiss that commandment and understand what could have motivated them to do it. Because again, I go back to what you just said. We're guilty of doing the same thing. How often is it that we will justify our own sin, even though we know it's wrong? We know it's a violation of what God said. We'll find a reason why it's acceptable in this situation, because in this situation, we've got extenuating circumstances that make the sin okay. No. And I think in this case, they probably believe, yes, God wants us to make, if I'm justifying it and I'm putting myself in their sandals, God said make no graven images, but the other gods do like graven images, and we need the other gods on our side in order to help us with this God, and therefore graven images are okay because we're using them for these gods in order to get back and, it's a convoluted explanation, and I might completely be wrong. I will just lay that out there on the table. But I find it to be at least a plausible explanation as to why so quickly they're able to turn back. And again, you see just how wrong it is when you see God's words to Moses up on the mountain when God sends him back down to stop the people in their sins.
I think it just, to me, big picture wise, it goes to show definitely a need for an intermediary.
Yeah.
Someone like Jesus who was to know.
Yep.
And that's a great picture from that long ago.
Yeah.
Up to now.
Absolutely. Logan?
To me, my interpretation of this passage has always mostly been when they see Moses, disappearing into the mountain and not being back for 40 days. Obviously, probably a lot of them assume that he's dead. And so my interpretation of that is once they, kind of think or believe that he's dead, they think that they have not only lost their mediator with God, but they have lost favor with God. Now, I don't know if they're expecting punishment for that. Obviously, they've been complaining about Moses, also about God and his lack of supplying them with their needs. But once they built the golden calf, I know it does say the verse where Aaron says, "We'll make a feast of the Lord." My interpretation of that is maybe that is them trying to get back in God's graces, but then building the golden calf is kind of like a backup plan where, hey, if God Almighty is not going to deliver us out of this place, then we're going to go and sacrifice or build a calf and sacrifice to other gods, so that maybe they will find favor with us and deliver us out of this.
Yeah. It could be. Another possible interpretation of this is the golden calf. Which region is that associated with? Not Egypt. Canaan. Baal. So Baal is represented by the golden calf. There is an Egyptian god that has bull's horn, but very not commonly is it a golden calf. Golden calves are typically Baal and Canaanite worship. So it could be, again, they know where they're headed. They're trying to get in favor with the god of the region that they're headed to, because again, they've been without probably real clear instructions for generations, right? So maybe there's something to that also. Again, we're not told all the specifics there. Larry?
Not only did they hear God say, they all said, we will do it.
Yep. And they did not. Absolutely. Keith?
I have a problem with the timeline. In fact, like you said, it is spread out. Back in chapter 19, he goes up, he talks to God, people are afraid. God sends him back down. Is he going up and down the mountain, or are these separate times? Because he's already been up and gone back down. And there was smoke, there was, ground shaking, and there was all kind of things that it scared him. And so, God calls them stiff-necked people, which between making the gods, and he's been up once before and all this, and he came back down, and he goes back up again, and now they think he's gone.
Yeah.
So, he's just so upset with them because they're stiff-necked and they won't listen.
So he's been up a couple of times, is my understanding, but I don't believe he's ever been up for 40 days and 40 nights.
Is he just coming back down and saying something to people and going back up? The reason I'm saying that is I feel like that they did hear the thunder and the shaking, ground shaking, and the smoke and all that kind of stuff. They'd seen it once before. And so when he comes back down and he was alive then, I guess just because of the time frame, they didn't have faith in God, I guess.
Yeah.
Moses or whatever. It just felt like, well, this time he didn't make it back.
Yeah, so it seems that he had, I think it's twice. He's been up and down twice. Back in chapter 19 is when the smoke and the fire and all of that started. I don't know if it was continual from then until this point, or if that was something that was, just for that moment, and then it's come back for this moment, or how all of that has worked. But you do have the back and forth. I don't know that he's ever been gone for this length of time. And I think that's probably what makes the difference with the people here.
I think you also have to take in mind the context. They are a very impatient people.
Yep.
They have always been very stubborn.
Yeah, they're stubborn and stupid in so many different ways. So yeah, those tend to go hand in hand, right? People get stupid and then they get stubborn in their stupidness. So a lot of different options there. So now again, as we were familiar with the story, God's angry. God says, I'm going to destroy him. I'll start over with you, Moses. Moses argues against that. No, that will be a horrible witness to the nations around. You promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that you were going to bring this people. You need to bring this people into their land. God relents. Moses comes down with the 2 tablets that I've always found it interesting. We always talk about the 10 commandments written on the 2 tablets. Maybe it says that somewhere. I don't know that it ever actually says that. It says that the testimony, the tablets of the testimony, whatever is on that, and they're written front and back and on both sides. Like it's yeah. Oh, I know. God's timeless. He can pull language from later. Yeah, so we've got all of that on these tablets. He brings them down. He throws them down on the ground because he's so angry. He confronts Aaron. Aaron makes up that dumb explanation. Maybe there's some intelligence behind it that I don't understand, but I don't understand it. But Moses saw that the people. Here, part of what I also find interesting is that part of the description of what's going on is the unruliness of the people. It's not just the golden calf, but you read here, verse 25, Moses saw that the people were out of control, for Aaron had let them get out of control, making them a laughing stock to their enemies. And Moses stood at the camp's entrance and said, whoever is for the Lord, come to me. So I don't know what all is involved in that. It seems to me that this has turned not just into a feast for the Lord, but it has turned into something much worse than that, without getting too descriptive. That this is just a throw caution to the wind and we're going to engage in whatever, this is a riot of sorts. This is a every person out of control and things are turning into a disaster. So he says, whoever's for the Lord, come to me. And the Levites gathered around them. He told them, this is what the Lord says. Go, fasten on your sword. Go kill brother, neighbor, anybody, any of the men. They do that. About 3,000 men die, and the Levites are blessed because of this. We know that this is why they are later chosen to be the priesthood, because of this moment of faith. I don't know, to go back to your question, Keith, I don't know that this means that nobody else is for the Lord. I think part of the difference here is that these are the people who were willing to take responsibility, which is why they are chosen for the job among the Israelites that requires the most responsibility and dedication to the Lord. And so I think the reward matches the decision in this case. Now, it could be my assumption is completely wrong and they were completely turning their back on God. And Aaron just giving lip service to God in the way that he offers a festival to Yahweh. I'm not a hill I'm going to die on, to be honest. But it's something that is interesting that here, while the context of the Levites killing their brethren has more to do with the lack of control, the riotousness of the people, than it does the actual celebration of the fatted calf. Because following day, following day, Moses takes care of the calf, right? If the issue were just the calf, that's something Moses clearly could take care of because he does it. The issue seems to be getting order back among the people. And that's what the Levites do. They go out there and they essentially shut the party down by killing 3,000 people. So that seems to me to be more of the issue there. The Lord replies, verse 33, whoever has sinned against me, I will erase from my book. Because Moses has just asked for forgive their sins, but if not, please don't erase me from the book. God says, I will erase the people who have sinned. And so then they move on. So this also leads to one of the, I think, saddest moments in this part of the story, in that at this point, this is when the tent of meeting is moved outside the camp. And what does that signify? Do what? Yeah, God is separating himself from the people. And I find that to be, there's a little bit of an argument here between Moses and God about God's not going to go with them. He would send his angels before them, but God's not going to go with them, and Moses is very upset by that. And you've got this removal of the tent of meeting from the middle of the people. And so you just got that kind of sadness to the story here. Chapter 33, verse 9, when Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would come down, remain at the entrance to the tent. The Lord would speak with Moses. As all the people saw the pillar of cloud remaining at the entrance of the tent, they would stand up and bow and worship, each one at the door of his own tent. The Lord would speak with Moses face to face, just as a man speaks with a friend. Then Moses would return to the camp. His assistant, the young man Joshua, son of Nun, would not leave the inside of the tent. So a couple of little interesting tidbits there. You've got this interesting face-to-face, but is it really face-to-face? Yeah, I mean, just a little bit later, you've got God saying, you cannot see me face-to-face, or else, no human can see my face or they will die. Clearly that's just an idiom for intimate conversation, right? Face-to-face conversation. But that idea of they would meet together, and that's how God or Moses would get direction. So you see that here Again, the face-to-face comment down in verse 20, you cannot see my face, for humans cannot see me and live. So they have face-to-face conversations without actually Moses seeing his face. But they're able to have that sort of interaction. Secondly, I've always found it interesting that Joshua stays in the tent. Did you notice that? Joshua stays in the tent. Okay, Joshua the son of Nun would not leave the inside of the tent unless seemingly there was a reason to do that. Maybe that's talking about just during these interactions between Moses and God, or it makes me think of Samuel. I don't know if you've ever noticed that Samuel lives inside the tabernacle, which is kind of an odd piece of that story, isn't it? Because we don't ever think of people living inside the tabernacle, but he does. But here you've got this second in command, in this case, living inside the tent of meeting. And then you've got, in Samuel's case, the newly chosen judge and the second priest living inside the tabernacle. It just, little pieces of that, just connections there that I think are interesting. But you've got this follow-up story of Moses wanting to see the Lord's glory, and God, of course, wanting to see the Lord, and God says, no, but I'll let you see my glory or my goodness, the Christian Standard Version says. And so that's what he gets to see, and God protects him and allows him to see that. And so you've got that great little picture there. Chapter 34 says that essentially starts trouble. What happens to Moses as a result of all this, all these meetings? What happens to Moses as a result of all these meetings with God? His face starts to glow, which that is astonishing to me. That here Moses, because of all these meetings, it changes his actual physical appearance, because his face becomes radiant. And that doesn't mean like you tell a pregnant woman how radiant she looks. Like that is, he literally, his face has its own light that comes out of his skin of some sort. To the point to where, what does he have to start doing? Wearing a veil all the time. Because it is such a strange sight that it frightens the people. And so he must wear a veil whenever he is out and among the people. And so, do what?
It seems to me there's more to it than that.
Maybe.
What the New Testament says about seeing the Lord fading.
Yeah. So later on, when his face stops glowing so much because of the absence of the Lord with the people, he continues to wear the veil because he doesn't want people to realize that the radiance is disappearing, because that would have been disheartening to the people. But again, I just find the whole thing interesting. Larry?
This about Moses won't see God's face kind of is a little different understanding than when we have 70 going up to see God.
Yeah.
But they obviously didn't see God.
Yeah. Well, and that's where, again, I proposed maybe because it points out that they could see what was beneath his feet, right? That what was beneath his feet was that blue lapis lazuli looking area. And so I think my layman's understanding of that would be they probably didn't dare lift their eyes any higher than that. So they were in God's presence, but they never really saw God's face because they were too overwhelmed by it. Moses here wants to see God and wants to see God's face, and of course God won't allow it because of the danger that poses. And so again, I find that interesting. Keith?
Sermon series for you. Maybe just one sermon.
Ooh. You know, nothing's a one sermon with me. Yeah.
But yeah, the whole face presence of God thing is very sermonesque. But the other thing, we skipped over a bit, but I think we see here and also in passing accounts kind of the anti-Levin-ness of God. Maybe I missed it in my study. But is there ever like a sort of reason why Levin is so like seen as unholy? Because even do not present the blood from outside anything Levin. Is that just because of Passover, or is there something about?
Where are you at?
I'm looking at chapter 34 or 25.
Okay. I think that's dealing, because we've got here several laws that are given. It's mentioned back up in verse 18, observe the festival of unleavened bread. You've got several different statements. And then verse 22, the festival of weeks. And so I think the sacrifice of the Passover festival must not remain until morning. I think it's dealing with the Passover sacrifice in that case. So, leaven is not in and of itself unholy. I think the point of it in this case was it reminded them truly of the story of the Exodus. The getting rid of the leaven and the work of preparation involved with that reminded them of them essentially sweeping their houses clean because they were leaving those homes permanently. And so I think it's more of a reminder of that. I don't know that there's any necessarily specialness to unleavened bread or evilness to leaven, other than when Jesus makes the statement of beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. But again, it's just an illustrative connection there, because it allows people to realize, one spoiled apple spoils the bunch, same kind of idea. So we're going to come back to that little section in just a moment. So again, I love this whole picture of, like, I started off this whole story of the Exodus with appreciate the character of Moses, appreciate what he went through. Even here in the sense of he wore a veil every day in order to protect the understanding of the people is remarkable. Like that had to. How many of us complained about face masks over the past several years? Yeah. I mean, that's essentially what Moses did for the rest of his life. He wore a face mask for the sake of the people, right? And that is a pretty remarkable thing, that he was willing to essentially put aside any convenience of his own for the sake of serving God and serving God's people and putting them first. Again, just appreciate the character of Moses and learn some lessons from that. That is the same character that meek people are supposed to have. And it just displays his meekness all over again. Chris?
I think you can see that when he was conversing with God about the rebellion of the people.
Yeah.
He said, I'll just kill them and make somebody out of you. He could have went, they're good people.
Yeah.
You can make some good people out of me. But he didn't do that.
No.
He had God's interest. Not only the people, the interest of the people, but God's interest in what the countries and nations around would think about him.
Yeah. Yeah. Keith?
I think this is possibly, he's talking about that statement there about, I'll destroy them and make people eat. All the people have been basically tested. The fact that Moses has gone and all this. Everybody knew Moses. And I think that this was a test for Moses when he said this. In the fact that, when Moses turned around and says, don't you remember the promise and all this? And he talked him out of it. I don't really believe for a minute that Moses' thoughts were higher than God's thoughts at this point. It's just not possible. And I just feel like that, just like Jesus was telling him, cast yourself down. And I wonder if it might be somewhat of a parallel in this, that it doesn't say that it doesn't, I'm saying it is, but somewhat of a parallel of a test for Moses. Because God had already promised that, it's not going to come through Moses, it's going to come through Abraham, through, the thing will come through Jesus, will come through everybody else.
Well, and so I've thought about this some and thought, I do think you're right. I do think God knew exactly what was going to happen, even when he said, this is what I'm willing to do, and Moses goes, no. I think it was, in many ways, it solidified Moses's understanding of himself as a ruler of the people, or of a leader of the people. But secondly, I do think that God could have done this, and that had God created a family out of Moses, that still would have been the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so it could have happened, but I think you're right in that I don't know that it would have happened because God knew exactly the way all of this was going to pan out.
How could Jesus come through Judah, these people were struggling?
That's a good point about Judah. I hadn't thought about Judah. Because Moses is not a descendant of Judah, he's a descendant of Levi. Yeah, so there you go. Do what? God could have, but I do, Keith does bring up a good point, so there you go. Yeah. And again, as you go through the story, there are several times when God's like, okay, I'm done with this. But it's one of those, I do think you're 100% right on the God's testing Moses. I think there's a learning aspect for Moses in this, and having to defend a people, even to God. It creates more of that sense of loyalty and the character of a leader that you see here.
Notice a little bit about God too, especially when you get to the Nehemiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, where God has made this proclamation against his people, and then he relents.
Mm-hmm.
He does what he says he's going to do. He gets them out. He takes them away. Then he brings them back. I think it's a snapshot of God's character. And he gets angry.
Yeah.
Don't think for a minute he doesn't get angry. He'll say something, and he'll make something, make a proclamation, and he can do it.
Yeah.
But he is, like it said back in 34, verse 5, the Lord passed before him, proclaiming the Lord is a God, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, who will by no means clear the guilty. And God said that. The Lord said that. Jehovah said that.
Yeah.
So that's part of his character. And I think we need to recognize that. And even though he makes those proclamations, he can be reasoned with. And he can, if people will repent and do right, as those prophets say,
Yeah.
then they will be clear, they will be judged righteous.
Yeah. Keith?
Yeah, in general, this goes to Keith's point, but I think you made a point about how God asked the question for Moses' sake, and I think that's pointed, just because God knows how we're going to react. The benefit is on our side. We have to experience, that tension, that decision. I think Moses goes through that, and that's the case for us too.
Yeah. Yeah. So they do start over with the 2 tablets, right? Moses has to carry some tablets back up the mountain, and God's going to write with his finger on the 2 new tablets. And he gets up there, and that's where you have this great proclamation of God's character that Chris just read for us there in the middle of, or beginning of chapter 34, which is, interestingly, the most repeated long description of God in the Old Testament. It is said over and over and over again, this one expression of who God is, that he is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in faithful love and truth. That description of God is just all over the place. And then, of course, you see it displayed in the way that God presents himself. I do love verse 8, chapter 34, verse 8. Moses immediately knelt low to the ground and worshiped. Then he said, my Lord, if I have indeed found favor with you, my Lord, please go with us, even though this is a stiff-necked people. Forgive our iniquity and our sin, and accept us as your own possession. That idea of continual submission to God needs to be the description of the way God's people are. And I think sometimes we can lose sight of that. It goes immediately on to talk about some of the laws. I tend to wonder, we talked earlier about how we always picture these 2 tablets as being the 10 Commandments with Roman numerals. Here, it's interesting, he gets these laws on tablets, and then immediately we have this list of laws. And I kind of wonder if it's not this that's written on the tablet. Not necessarily the 10 Commandments, but here you've got all of these statements made about, verse 17, do not make cast images of gods for yourselves. Like, is that important for them to hear? Clearly, yes. They just messed that one up, right? So, I mean, that's there I think probably on the tablet. Here, observe the festivals of unleavened bread. Firstborn male from every womb belongs to me. You should labor for 6 days. You've got some of the 10 Commandments expressed in here, but some of it is more general stuff, like end of verse 26, you must not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Like, that's in here. And I think probably if these are the laws that are inscribed on the stones, which would make sense in the context, then that's something that they take seriously. Now, they interpret that in the weirdest of weird ways these days, but it is, again, it was a statement of non-defilement, and that's why that becomes an important principle for their law. Yes?
Well, verse 28 says that you don't take commandments worth the
Is
commandments.
that where it is? Where does it say that? Where does it say it? Because I looked for it.
Exodus 34:28.
28. Oh, you wrote the 10 Commandments, the word of the covenant on the cabinet. Okay. Well, there you go. That's why we have that understanding. With Roman numerals. So,
We just listen to tablets. The first one, I don't think we have that scheduled.
we don't. And that's why I was looking. Like, what was actually written on there? So that's my fault for missing that. It's amazing how many times you can read the text and you miss stuff every single time. So it's the same way when I edit stuff.